Hey, welcome back. We are on 5.7 Meat Production Methods. Our learning objectives for today are to identify different methods of meat production, identify environmental impacts of meat production, and describe benefits and drawbacks of different methods of meat production. So firstly, when we talk about meat production, we're not just talking about cows. We're really talking about the raising of any cattle, so things like chickens, turkeys, pigs, sheep, goats, or any other livestock for consumption by humans. And generally, we're talking about on a really large scale. And so we're going to break that raising of cattle into two different categories. One is free range grazing cattle, which we've kind of talked about a little bit, and we're going to talk about a little bit more. And then also CAFOs, or concentrated animal feeding operations, which you may not be familiar with. So we're going to talk a lot about the negative impacts of consuming meat today, but I think I want to make it clear that it's really not about consuming meat, it's about the overconsumption of meat. It's that we're eating too much of it, and there's a huge environmental impact associated with overconsumption of meat products. And so we really see this as a problem in more developed countries, or countries that are developing or in that industrial phase, because we generally see this association that as countries become wealthier, they tend to consume more meat, or the association of eating meat seems to be a sign of wealth. And so you can kind of see here which countries are consuming the most meat annually. Of course, the United States is up there, but developing countries tend to eat much less, and that's because there's a high cost associated with raising livestock, not just in purchasing livestock, but in feeding and maintaining them, as well as having the space to house them and raise them. So we tend to see less of that in a developing country. And then again, most of the environmental impacts that we see don't come from consumption, but overconsumption of meat. And we're going to talk about what those impacts are. So firstly is land use. It takes a lot of space to raise large quantities of meat, whether that's in a concentrated animal feeding operation or whether that's free grazing. It takes a lot of space because cattle, unlike a crop, is a large animal, or takes up more space than raising something like plants. And because in developing countries there is such a high demand, we see a lot of space being taken up by land space being taken up by actually raising this livestock. Now, obviously, one of the biggest issues is, of course, after you have all these animals and you're feeding them, there's going to be waste and emissions coming from all of those animals. The one that you're probably the most familiar with are methane emissions. Now, this one is specific actually to cows only. Part of their regular digestion process is to release methane as part of the gas that is emitted from them, like cow farts or burping, for instance. Now, this is amplified by feeding cows a high grain diet versus a grass diet. But in either situation, cows naturally emit methane. But if we have very large quantities of cows, we're breeding more and more and more of them, and we're feeding them these high grain diets because it's cheaper for us than free grazing, then we tend to see a much higher amount of methane emissions coming from livestock raising. And methane, or CH4, is a prominent greenhouse gas that we're worried about that's contributing to the increase in global temperatures. The next thing is the storage of their waste. So if you can imagine, if you have all of these cows that you're feeding, thousands and thousands of cows in one area, then you've got lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of cow poop. Cow poop is really high in nitrate and phosphate levels. So if there is any type of runoff coming from an area where livestock is being raised and it ends up in a nearby waterway, that could be largely problematic and cause eutrophication. Additionally, there's a pretty bad smell associated with it. So from an aesthetic point of view, people don't generally like to live near CAFOs. And they also, actually, I guess I didn't put this in here, but also E. coli. So there is fecal coliform bacteria present in a lot of animal waste. This is mainly E. coli. That is harmful for humans. The consumption of E. coli can be problematic. So if that waste is getting out, that can be problematic for humans. So the question you should be asking yourself is, where are these manure lagoons, or where is this waste stored? And the answer is manure lagoons. It's basically kind of what it sounds like. It's a big hole in the ground where they collect all of the cow feces and put it in a big pile until somebody comes around and collects it, and then they will put it into a landfill, basically dehydrate it and then put it into a landfill. The process of placing everything in a big pit in the ground and letting it just sit there does also release methane. It's pretty gross, and you can imagine the smell is pretty gross. It also takes up more space in landfills. There is this sort of newer technology that's being implemented largely in California, where we will actually tent these manure lagoons and actually collect the methane that is coming off of a lot of the waste in these large storages of like cow feces. And then we collect the methane and use it to burn energy. Now, of course, this releases carbon dioxide, but it at least gives us some energy. Now, there's also the 10% rule. So remember, the 10% rule says that we lose only 10% of energy gets transferred from each trophic level. In the process of eating meat, you are moving through 2 trophic levels versus just 1 trophic level when you are consuming. So, for instance, we feed a lot of grain to cows, and generally we feed corn, some type of corn to cows. Now, if a human eats corn, we are gaining the majority of the energy from the corn, and it's more efficient. Whereas if we have to feed corn to cows and then humans have to eat those cows, that's more levels, more transfers through the trophic pyramid. So it's less efficient to eat at that trophic level. Additionally, if we're going to feed cows, we have to raise that corn crop to feed the cows. Raising that corn crop is going to take up space on land to grow it. It's going to take water. It's going to impact our soil, and that isn't even going to humans. It's going to feed cows, and then the cows are going to eat that, and then the humans are going to eat the cows. So we see a much larger impact on the actual process when we go to eat meat. Additionally, antibiotics and growth hormones, any kind of cows, or I keep using cows, but really any type of livestock that's being raised in a really concentrated area, they're in close proximity to each other, are probably going to have some type of antibiotic or growth hormone given to them. The antibiotics, of course, are used to keep the cows from getting sick because they're living in such close quarters. This, of course, can cause an antibiotic resistance. And then we also generally give hormones to a lot of our livestock because we want them to be larger, we want them to yield more meat, because that will make us more money. There is still some debate as to whether giving growth hormones to cows can be problematic for human consumption later. It's still something that people discuss. But either way, we're not allowing the cow to naturally grow to its size. We are making it larger much quicker so that it can be sent to market much faster. And then the last thing, of course, is soil compaction and erosion. If you have a lot of ungulates or hoofed animals all in one given area, all trampling on the soil, on the ground, that's going to lead to compaction of the soil, which is going to lead to issues with erosion as well as infiltration of water into the soil. And then possibly a decrease in biodiversity if they're killing some of the natural grasses or producers that live in that area. So again, this isn't about stopping meat consumption, it's about reducing it. And so some of the impacts of reducing our meat consumption could be a decrease in carbon emissions, in methane emissions, and nitrous oxide emissions. All of these are greenhouse gases. The carbon emissions largely come from all of the mechanization involved in keeping cows alive. So whether that's the carbon emissions associated with raising the grain, the mechanization of the grain raising, the transferring of the grain, the transferring of the cows, the slaughtering of the cows, that all requires energy. And there's generally going to be some type of fossil fuel use that's going to have carbon emissions. The methane, of course, comes from the feces associated with cows specifically, and nitrous oxide emissions come from the slaughtering process itself, as well as any time we're burning a fossil fuel. And so reducing meat consumption can reduce some of these harmful greenhouse gases. It will help us to conserve water. We don't have to give water to as many of our livestock, as well as the water that's used to raise the grain that's used to feed the cattle. So it will save some water. Reduce the use of antibiotics and growth hormones. This is good. We see less antibiotic resistance, and we're eating a more natural meat that doesn't require a growth hormone, that we're allowing the animal itself to get to size naturally. And to reduce the impact on topsoil, you have less ungulates impacting that soil that could be very nutrient rich. So let's talk about the two ways in which they're raised. CAFOs, or concentrated animal feeding operations. These you've probably seen on like the side of the 5 if you've ever driven it. You can generally smell them before you can see them. It looks like miles and miles of cows that are living in very close quarters to each other. You can see they don't have a lot of room to actually like roam around or anything like that. They're all going to be very close to each other. These are going to be the areas where you generally see even more antibiotic use, because this is an area that would be very prone to disease spreading very quickly. You're most definitely going to have growth hormones given to these types of cows because they're not moving around as much. So they're not going to bulk up with muscle as quickly. So they will need to be given not only growth hormones, but probably a very high caloric diet. Again, this is generally going to be grain versus grass, because grain will bulk a cow up much more quickly than will grass. And so because they're not moving, because they're eating this high caloric diet, these cows will go to slaughter and market much faster. And that allows the livestock farmer to make money much more quickly and turn around, purchase more, and do the whole thing again. This in turn makes it cheaper for the consumer. So generally consuming meat from CAFOs is much cheaper. So this is why some people are like, is this grass-fed beef? Because they don't want to consume meat from an animal that has lived in a concentrated feeding operation. CAFOs are very efficient. There's a couple plus sides. 1, it does yield cheaper meat, and 2, it takes up less land space. Whereas if you're talking about grazing animals, you need a lot of space for those animals to roam and a lot of grass that they're going to eat. A concentrated animal feeding operation is very condensed, so it takes up much less space, and so that means less of an impact to the natural world. One thing, and I kind of already mentioned this, is the collection of biogas. This also allows us to perhaps capture some of that methane and prevent it from entering into the atmosphere. And it also gives us a source of energy that we could potentially burn, meaning some livestock farms are actually making their own energy on location, because they are collecting methane and burning it right there on site. So that in itself can be kind of nice, but generally CAFOs are looked at as negative. Now, if you follow any of the PETA stuff, they generally show a lot of like really dramatic images of like cows being slaughtered, or like, chickens with 3 eyes or something like that, because they're just mass breeding and they're mass feeding and they're mass slaughtering. They tend to show like really, really dramatic photos. This is usually what they're showing. They're showing images of CAFOs, and generally there are standards for CAFOs. Like you can only have so many cows, per square mile of your operation. There are regulations. It's not like a total free-for-all, but of course there are places that are less regulated, and some of those PETA images, though dramatic, do reflect the conditions in some of these areas. And then the last slide here is another way that we raise cattle, which is free-range grazing, which we kind of talked about with Joel Salatin. The grass-fed cows these are cows that are allowed to just sort of roam and graze on the land naturally. Grass is more of a naturally what cows would eat, so it tends to be easier on their digestive system. These cows are wandering around a lot more. Because of this, because of their diet, they'll take a lot longer to get large and beefy, so it will take them longer for them to go to market. So it's going to be more of a cost investment for you when you're waiting on the cows to be large enough for slaughter. But you are saving money in other ways. You don't need antibiotics to raise these because they're going to be much further away. But on the flip, you're going to need a lot of land. So to have enough land where there's enough grass to feed a decent amount of cows, you're going to need a very, very large open space. And the cost of land, of course, isn't cheap. So that can be problematic. This can also be a problem with overgrazing. If you put too many cows in one land, this is the true example of the tragedy of the commons, when they're on common grazing land or publicly owned land for grazing, and a farmer wants to take advantage of that public land. You can end up with overgrazing problems. This is when we talked about the Taylor Grazing Act, where farmers do have to have permits to have cows on public lands, but of course that's pretty hard to regulate when you've got farmers all over the United States using public lands. So potentially overgrazing and all of the issues associated with overgrazing. So soil erosion, loss of biodiversity, increased amounts of runoff, decreased amounts of infiltration into soil, desertification, etc. So problematic as well. Again, the whole idea here is that we decrease the amount of meat that we're consuming, not that we stop altogether, because there is a need for protein in people's diets, and you can get that other ways, but a large portion of people do receive protein from animal meat. And so, again, a decrease in consumption would largely help with some of these environmental issues that we talk about. Okay, I think that's it. I will see you guys in class. Let me know if you have questions. Thanks.